Hi folks, this is going to be a response to a video that Tetsuba posted recently, and it was actually a question or a comment that was given to him by one of his viewers or subscribers. And this was specifically talking about urgency, immediacy, progression, and those concepts in role-playing games. And to kind of paraphrase what was being poised or what was being asked, is that, this person has players or they themselves come from kind of a background of video role-playing games, like World of Warcraft or the Elder Scrolls series, Skyrim and Oblivion and Dragon Age or Baldur's Gate even, any of those kinds of games. The idea that in video role-playing games, progression is very immediate, that actions have very kind of instant gratification to them. You click the mouse and something happens. It's very flashy and it's very immediate. There's urgency there, that you're in real time. And so they were asking about how can you translate this into tabletop role-playing games, which are generally much more methodical, which are much slower, and then they just kind of have a different pacing to them. And how do you kind of bridge that gap? How do you get people who are more interested in that sort of rapid development, rapid progression in characters and instant gratification into a role-playing game? And before I go into some options and some systems that I've had experience with that handle progression in some different ways that you might be able to take and use in your own games, I just wanted to kind of talk about that concept in general, the concept of instant gratification. Tabletop role-playing games and video role-playing games are fundamentally different in a particular respect, and that respect is that video games, for the most part, unless you're talking about a certain niches of video games such as turn-based strategy games, video games happen in real time. So you click for your character to go over here, and the computer makes your character go over here. You click on the enemy to make your character attack them, and your character starts swinging their sword. It's a very visual medium, right? And the computer is doing most of the work for you. So all you have to do is turn the computer on, and the game is there in front of you, and it's waiting for you to give it input. So there's not a lot of lag between when you give a command and when the command is issued, when you go into a tavern and when the tavern is presented before you. One of the things to consider is the fact that when you're talking about tabletop role-playing games, all this is happening in the imagination, and most importantly, it's a process of building that mental image. That the mental image isn't just going to be there for you, for the most part. Now, if you find yourself in a position where you're really immersed in a game, and those games really start to pop, and basically you can almost kind of imagine things happening in real time. But most of the time in role-playing games, you have to kind of stop and ask questions. The GM has to set a scene. He can't rely upon some way to instantly communicate to you what your character sees, what's around them, what's going on. They have to describe this. They have to kind of set out the scene and tell you, and what that usually prompts from players then is a process of question and answer. So, this GM describes a scene, and then the players say, okay, but what's over here? Or what does this look like? Or what happens if I go through this door? And so basically whereas in a video game, all you have to do is say, okay, well, I go through this door, and then instantly, your senses are going to be engaged in whatever it is behind that door. But in a role-playing game, you have to ask the question, and then the GM has to give you a response. And then if that response is unclear in any way, he has to elaborate on it. There might be additional questions and answers. But the point I'm getting at here is a process that might take, say, 10 seconds to occur in a video game. Let's say a simple combat. You're playing Skyrim and you come across a troll, and you fight the troll. Okay, well, you go up and you click on the troll and you start swinging your sword and you cast your spells, and then boom, you kill the troll and he's dead. Well, so that might take 10 seconds in a video game. But in a role-playing game, what might be just 10 seconds of action within the game world, within the context of game time, might take an hour. Hopefully not in a simple combat scenario, but it could. It could very well take you 30 minutes to kind of resolve the back and forth of, okay, well, this is what my character can do. Okay, this is what I'm gonna do. Okay, now you got to roll your dice. Okay, now what happens as a result of that? Okay, now what does the troll do in response to that? And so the computer obviously can think a billion times faster than a human being can. And so the computer is programmed to kind of do all these algorithms in the background and do them so quickly that that responses are instantaneous. And all the rolls are effectively calculated for you, all the statistics are drawn up, and it's all put into a nice formula, and the formula just spits out a number, and the computer instinctively knows what to do with that number. But in a role-playing game, for one, there's no programmed responses, right? In a role-playing game, the potential responses both of the player characters and of the NPCs and the environment around them are very much basically at the whim of the decisions of the people involved. That the people have to actually actively make their own creative decisions and use their own logic to figure out what would happen and how things are going to respond. But the options in that particular sense are limitless. As the Strolling Bones has said a couple times, and it's a point that I absolutely agree with, one of the strengths of role-playing is that your options are really limitless. You can climb any tree, you can pick up any rock, you can basically do just about anything that you could potentially imagine your character doing. Whereas in a video game, if it's not been programmed to be possible within the game, it's not possible. You can't climb a tree unless the programmers have specifically intended for you to be able to climb that tree. But again, the trade-off for that is that the video game, if it's already programmed that the video game is capable of doing it, it can do it instantly. It knows exactly, it says, okay, this is the path that I need to follow. And there's no variation, there's no question about the fact that you can follow that path. So the point I'm trying to get to is that in a general sense, you can't quite expect the same sort of gratification and the same sort of speed, the same sort of back and forth that goes on in a video game, in a tabletop role-playing game, simply because of the lag of the different media that is involved here. That you're using essentially a very different system that works at very different speeds, under very different operational parameters, and so you can't expect any human being to be able to render a game world in quite the same fashion that a computer or video game system could do. But that point aside, there are some ways that you can address if your players or if yourself are kind of concerned about immediacy, urgency, and just the general speed of progression, or if just players feeling like things are happening, like their characters are constantly growing, that that there's not any wasted time, that they're actually getting somewhere with their characters, and not spending months at a time feeling like their characters are just treading water and they're not really they're doing things but they're not really accomplishing anything for themselves, they're not advancing their goals, they're not getting better at their skills, they're not gaining new wealth or status or allies or something like that. Now, many game systems, many of the most popular game systems, and I'm just going to use D&D as an example because, well, let's face it, it's the most popular role-playing game, that generally work off of a system called a leveling system. And what this generally does, one of my other subscribers, Philippe Gojira, something like that, forgive me if I'm butchering your name, but he brought up a good point that in these level-type systems like D&D, basically your character's advancement is represented by an experience point number. You have a number of experience points, and once you get a certain amount of them, then boom, your character becomes better. You gain a level, and you get a whole bunch of little perks that come along with that. And so oftentimes what happens, now at earlier levels it might be pretty quick, but as you advance in the game, generally what happens is that the progression slows down, that it takes more and more experience points for your character to gain the next level, to get even more powerful. And so that can kind of drag things out, where at first maybe it was every 2 to 3 game sessions you were gaining a level, and then now you find you're kind of like dragging yourself through 6 or 7 or 8 game sessions without gaining a level, and it's just because of the nature of the way the game is designed. But he brought up a very good point, that these experience points, though they accumulate to pushing you towards the goal, and that goal being of obtaining a new level, the experience points themselves don't do anything. They're just kind of this stagnant number. They just sit there on your character sheet, and you look down one day and you say, okay, well, I need 649 more experience points to gain a level. And, until those 649 experience points come my way, there's not really anything for me to do. And so, the experience point number itself is kind of boring. The GM okay, well, you get 300 experience points this session. Okay, well, I'm going to write down my 300 experience points, but that's about it. I guess, my character still hasn't gained a level yet, so I guess I don't get anything. And so basically, it kind of is a series of stop and goes. Basically, you either gain a level or you don't gain a level. And if you don't gain a level, nothing happens. But when you gain a level, all this cool stuff, you get all this new cool stuff. Well, there are different ways that there are different RPGs that handle progression in different ways, and one of my generalized preferred systems for ways characters are presented and built and the way they advance in many game systems is what I like to call incremental advancement. And it's systems where characters progress by increments, and those increments are generally fairly small and fairly specific. But oftentimes, many of those incremental progression systems kind of incorporate the idea of what's been called organic development. And that meaning that your characters will tend to advance in the aspects of themselves that they use, the aspects that they engage in. And so one particular example is a game called Call of Cthulhu. And in Call of Cthulhu, you don't have any experience points per se. You don't accumulate experience or advancement points or anything like that. But rather, when your character uses skills during the course of an adventure, you just mark a little check mark next to that skill to say, hey, I've successfully used this skill this adventure. And then at the end of the adventure, what you do is you look for all the skills that you've checked off, and then you basically make a roll to see, does your character improve in that skill? So the more your character uses their skills, the more likely they are to advance in them. And so if your character spends a whole lot of time running around, waving a handgun around, then he's going to naturally get better at shooting his handgun. The more your character spends kind of skulking around dark, alleyways and stuff like that, the more adept your character theoretically will become at sneaking. And the more your character, practices picking locks, the better he gets at picking locks. And so it's just a very natural instinctive system. And if your character doesn't use skills, well, unless he specifically goes out of his way to practice them or train them, he's not going to get any better at them. I'm not going to get any better at sewing until I actually sit myself down in a chair, grab some needles and thread, and start trying to sew. And so that's one possible way, because when you introduce the idea that characters don't have to advance in leaps and bounds all at one time, but rather they kind of advance piece by piece, you can introduce the idea that maybe every session simply say, okay, well, your character used these abilities. Those abilities may progress. They may get better because your character has practiced them. Going to this idea of experience points as currency, and this is a concept that I very much favor, probably because I come from a background of the Star Wars D6 role-playing game, and that experience in that game was a currency, basically. You accumulated these points and then you spent them, and so the points themselves become interactive. And so that's a way to engage the player by giving them another thing that they can look at and they can say, okay, well, this is a resource for my character and I can choose how I want to use this resource. And so it just adds another level of interest. It adds another level of immediacy, if you want to say it, or another level of progression, because effectively these are a form of progression for your character. Now, they're flexible in how they can be used, but they themselves are a progression. You accumulate these points, you spend them as you see fit, and again, in the Star Wars D6 system, it was an incremental progression system. So your character, it's not like you had to accumulate X number of experience points before you saw any benefit from them, but rather you accumulated experience points and then you could spend those experience points incrementally to increase different aspects of your character. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3rd Edition does another interesting approach to character progression, in that characters are assigned experience points. The rules suggest giving player characters 1 experience point per session. At any given time, there are at least 5 or 6 different things that a single experience point can get your character. So even at the end of a single session, you could spend an experience point to gain a new action for your character, to gain a new talent for your character, to train a new skill for your character. You can increase your attributes by a small amount, or alternatively, you can kind of save them up for bigger purchases. But what's kind of fun and rewarding and adds to that kind of immediate progression, that tangible feeling that your character is getting better, in Warhammer 3rd Edition is the fact that you can spend just 1 point. All it takes is just 1 point, and that 1 point can buy you something cool. There's always something cool that you can do with that experience point. And if you're actually handing out an experience point every session, then basically that means every time a player returns to the table, they've got something new. They've got some new tactics, some new skills, some new ability, some new advantage, and some new way to play their character. And it's kind of exciting, and I can see a lot of players liking that particular idea. Bing! So anyway, those are a few ideas, hopefully to kind of just get the ball rolling, get people thinking about if you want to address this idea of urgency, immediacy, and sort of rapid progression, instant gratification in games. Leave me any comments. Let me know if there's some other games, some other good examples that other people have encountered for different ways to handle progression. Again, as I said, I'm a pretty big fan of the idea of incremental advancement or progression in games, because generally it means that your characters are kind of constantly growing, they're constantly moving, albeit in smaller, more manageable chunks, but that makes it feel more rapid, and it's not just kind of a stop and go process like, say, in a level type system. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed. Leave me comments, and I will talk to you soon.